We are now live stream, as I can see, yes?
We are.
Thank you. Welcome to Rochford District Council's Remote Statutory Officer Personnel Committee meeting, and welcome to anyone who is watching via this live stream. Item 1, apologies for absence. My understanding is there have been no apologies received in the office. Item 2, substitute members attending. No substitutes have been notified to the office. Item 3, non-members attending. Non-members will be able to access the public part of this meeting via the live stream. Item 4, to receive declarations of interest. Are there any members who wish to declare an interest? Can't see, no. Thank you, members. Agenda item 5 is the statutory committee's training in the role of the committee. We have with us this afternoon David Kitson from Bevin, Britain. Welcome, David, who will guide us through the relevant training issues. Questions will be answered at the end of this by David if there are any, or other officers as appropriate. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. So you've all had a chance to read through the report, so I won't read it verbatim, unless you want me to, of course. But yeah, this is in essence an overview of, because this is, as you've heard, a brand new committee of the council. It's something that the council is required to have by law and through chief officer terms of and conditions of service as well. So that's why the council have set this committee up. So there are processes that have to be followed in relation to business being dealt with by the committee. So I'm going to try and give you an overview of that. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have at the end of the presentation. So, as I say, the council has to have a committee of this nature to deal with chief officer discipline, if you like. There are regulations, and there are also these, as I mentioned, joint negotiating committee terms and conditions of service, which are set out in a handbook. Now those, the joint negotiating committee is a joint committee between the LGA and Alice, which represents chief executives, and they have jointly negotiated appropriate terms and conditions for chief officers, chief executives, that are incorporated into those officers' contracts. So together the regulations themselves, the legal
David, could I just stop you there?
Apologies.
Yeah. Christine, you have your hand up. You wanted to ask a question at this point?
Yeah, I just wanted some clarification. I read through this report this morning, and I've got no issue with the report. For information, Sonia, I haven't got your email yet. I haven't had any emails from the council today, but I've read it online. The report, it says this committee is for the three senior officers, the monitoring officer, the chief finance officer, head of paid service, which again is obvious in some ways. However, and there's no disrespect meant here, Angela, the report's written by one of the officers that it affects, the monitoring officer. So I just wondered if that had been validated but externally, because there's obviously a potential conflict there. Now, I don't know if I'm right and I don't know if I'm wrong, but it just flagged up as a general concern. So before we go into the detail, I just wanted to know that that was okay. Some confirmation.
Would you like me to respond,
David,
Chair? Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Through you, Chair. Yeah, valid point. Yes, the report is in the name of the monitoring officer. As you say, the committee concerns those three officers. So the head of paid service, monitoring officer in section 151. This isn't about specific issues. This isn't about specific matters. what the council has to have in place is very much prescribed, if you like, by what the regulations say and what the JNC terms and conditions of service are. So this is simply, if you like, well, as it sounds, it's a training session. It's an overview of how these things might work moving forward if they were ever necessary. Because it's a new committee, it's important that you understand that and where the basis of these things lies, if you like. So, albeit ultimately, yes, it could deal with one of those three officers. That's not what we're dealing with here. This is a process you have to have in place by law and by the terms and conditions, the JNC terms and conditions. So I can see why you were concerned, and thank you for raising that. But Chair, it's not an issue of concern in relation to this matter.
Thank you. That's all I wanted, was confirmation that there was no issue there. And apologies, Angela, it's certainly nothing personal.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. Thank you, David.
You're welcome. If I can continue, Chair, if that's okay.
Please do.
Yeah. So the regulations provide statutory protection to the chief officers against dismissal. So what they say, in essence, is that those chief officers cannot be dismissed from their posts without a resolution of full council. And as I say, there is a process that has to be in place involving a committee of this nature, which would then ultimately lead up to a matter being taken to full council for determination. So I'll go through, as I say, it is quite a complex procedure and process. So I apologise in advance of that, but I'll try and set it out in a logical way. So the terms of reference for this committee are, as we've mentioned, they include dealing with disciplinary issues in relation to chief officers, and that also includes potentially dealing with settlements and severance agreements relating to those officers too. So the first step, I suppose, in terms of potential dismissals or disciplinary in relation to chief officers is consideration whether engaging the process with the committee is actually necessary. So ordinarily what you have in place is an initial consideration, often by an officer in consultation with the chair of the committee, as to whether an allegation or complaints against one of the chief officers are whether they're clearly unfounded, trivial, or whether they could be dealt with through some other process. So if they could, then they won't necessarily go through the committee process. Taking things to the formal process should really be a last resort, and that's in line with statutory guidance around these sorts of things as well. However, if it's felt at that initial stage that there may be something in this, and it's not, I say this, the allegations, it's not clearly unfounded or trivial, then the matter will be taken for what you would call an initial fact-finding exercise. That's not an investigation, as you would understand an investigation. It is what it sounds. It's gathering initial facts to enable a decision to be made as to whether there merits a further investigation, in essence. So what then happens is ordinarily either an officer of the council or an external consultant or professional can be engaged to undertake this initial fact-finding process, speak with the officer against whom the allegations have been made, put them to them, get their response to that, and gather information that's relevant to the allegations that have been made. What will
David, sorry to interrupt you again. And another member wishes to ask a question. Would you like to continue through the report first and then seek questions later, or take questions as they arise?
Is it a question that is, can it wait? If not, it's fine. I can deal
through
with
the chair. It wasn't a question that you were freezing. You were actually frozen a few seconds, and it was hard to understand you, David. That was what
right.
Comment. So
okay.
In case you had a problem with your connection, that was all it was, Chair. Thank you.
I didn't notice that. It may be your end, Lorraine.
All right. Okay.
Possibility.
Okay.
I don't think anyone else suffered that. But would you rather wait for questions later, David? Would that be better?
Yes, yeah, I think
Yeah.
if we can take questions at the end, that might be better.
Thank you, members.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Councillor Short. So as I say, the initial fact finding will then be brought to yourselves as the committee, and it's not the point at which there will be a detailed investigation, or should I say, not an investigation, but presentation of evidence. You can hear from witnesses, you can ask questions. Ordinarily, that doesn't happen. And the officer against whom the allegations are made is also able to attend to put their position forward at that stage. So that first hearing of the committee meeting is to come to a decision whether what's known as the threshold test is met. So in terms of the threshold test, what you are doing is looking at whether if the allegation was proved that's been made, would that lead to the dismissal or other action that would be recorded on the chief officer's personnel file? And if so, is there evidence to support the allegation? Is it sufficient to support the allegation, and therefore points towards there being a need for a further investigation? So you're not making a decision at that point on whether or not the allegations are proved or proven at all. What you're doing is forming that initial view. Is the allegation sufficiently serious? And if so, is there adequate information on the basis of the fact finding and the information put to the committee at that time to suggest that it's necessary to go to investigation? Now, at that point, if the committee isn't satisfied that that threshold test is met, then they can either make the decision, or yourselves can either make the decision that there be no further action, or that there be an unrecorded informal warning. So something short of being recorded on the file, in essence. If the committee are of the view that if the allegations were proven, it would warrant something being recorded on the file or a dismissal, then, and the evidence suggests that it needs to be looked at, then you go to a separate stage. So the next stage, if the committee believe that this threshold test is met, is to appoint an independent investigator. Now, what normally happens there is that contact will be made with the JNC, the Joint Negotiating Committee, as that I mentioned earlier, and they keep a list of independent investigators, and it's done on a taxi rank basis, if you like. So what they do is they take the next 3 investigators in line, and they put forward the names of those and CVs of those investigators to the council. What then happens is that those 3 individuals, that list and the CVs, are then given to the chief officer for them to make a decision which of those 3 they want to select to undertake the investigation. If the chief officer or the statutory officer doesn't make a decision within 14 days, then it falls back to the council to make a decision to appoint one of those 3. So once you have an investigator appointed, they will then undertake the investigation. So they will go off, they will gather evidence. Obviously, you would set terms of reference in terms of what they're expected to cover off. So they would work to those terms of reference. They would interview all relevant parties, gather all relevant information, and then they would write a report. Now, their report would then be brought back to the committee. And in that report, they would be stating their opinion in terms of the evidence. Is it adequate to support the allegations? If not, why not? If it is, why is it? And they will also be giving a view and recommendations as to what the appropriate action might be. So if they feel that the evidence doesn't support it, then they might be making a recommendation that there's no further action taken, or that something short of recommendation for dismissal perhaps is contemplated. So the hearing there will be a hearing, of course, where that report's presented, as I've said, and witnesses will be called, as will the statutory officer be given opportunity to come along to question witnesses themselves, to be questioned, etc., etc. So it's kind of a sort of a quasi-judicial hearing, if you like. So all the evidence is gathered, cross-examinations take place, and then a decision is made by yourselves what the outcome of that should be. So I don't know, well, you will have read the reports, and you'll have seen reference to the panel of independent persons. Now that panel is made up of the independent persons who are appointed by the council for the purposes of the standards legislation, so the Localism Act. Now, there are two ways that the process can go. So the JNC guidance envisages that there will, if there is a recommendation by the committee, having heard the evidence, that there should be a dismissal, that then goes to the independent panel for them to consider and give their views. Now, as you probably would agree, I mean, we've already got to a position where this is becoming quite a protracted process. So sometimes it's sensible to, rather than having that separate meeting of the panel, to invite the panel to sit as part of that hearing of the committee so that they can hear the evidence then, and there's no need to then repeat things. That's a matter for the council to determine in terms, or officers to see what's most appropriate in terms of process, depending on you know, the specific circumstances involved. So if the committee come to a decision that there's no further action, that's the decision that they make, and there's no further action, and it doesn't go any further. If they come to a decision that there is an issue, but that issue doesn't warrant dismissal, then they can make the decision at that point what that sanction should be. Now, there is a right of appeal against that, but I'll come back to that later on. As I say, if the committee determined that that there should be a recommendation for dismissal of that chief or statutory officer, then assuming that the panel have already sat as part of that committee, which, as I say, is a more sensible or resource light way of doing things, then the independent persons panel will go and write a report giving their views and advice on the recommendation, and the proposal will also go through an executive objections process. So that will very roughly, it goes to the leader, and they consult with members of cabinet as to whether there is any objection to that proposal. If there are any objections within a set period of time, then they are then put forward for consideration by the committee in terms of whether those objections are, well, if they're well made and supported, if you like. If they are, then there'll be a reconsideration as to the recommendation that's been made. May then be that it does still go on, but it may not. So assuming that it still goes to full council, there is a hearing of full council. The independent persons panel will be there. Their report will have been given to full council as well, as will the investigating report. Now this isn't a rerun of the full hearing of the evidence, if you like. It's a review of what's happened to date, the decision that's been made, the advice that's been given by the independent persons panel, etc. And then council are required to make a decision whether they agree with the recommendation to dismiss. As I say, it would only go to full council if it was a recommendation to dismiss. And if they do, then it's effective. If not, they can substitute the decision for something less, or they can send the matter back to yourselves to reconsider. Now, I mentioned rights of appeal. If the sanction, if you like, is less than dismissal, then there is a right of appeal. Now, in the report, there's an error for which, you know, I apologise. I think it's paragraph 3.2. It refers to any appeals going to the council's committee that's currently set up to hear licensing appeals and other appeals. That's not correct, in the sense that the council, I think what's been decided is that given that these sorts of things are hopefully incredibly rare, you know, it would be appropriate to instead set up an appeal committee if and when that was necessary, and that can be done relatively easily. So it's not the case that this will be added to the appeal function, will be added to that standing committee. So that's just to correct that error, and apologies on that
David,
front.
could I just say it's 3.6 in the
Sorry, 3.6. Excuse me. I've only got one screen, you see, and I don't have a printer.
page 5.2.
Okay, thank you for that,
Thank you.
Chair. So that is I know, as I said, it's quite a complex procedure. It's all there in the report. So, you know, I'd refer back to that in any case. Hopefully, it won't become something that happens frequently or you know, at all, but it has to be there by law. So there's a requirement that because it needs to be there by law, we need to explain to you, you know, how it functions if it were to be required. Now, the committee is also responsible, you'll have seen in the terms of reference, the committee is also responsible for consideration and determination of potential settlements or severance of chief officers' employment with the council. So
David, could I stop you again? I do apologise.
Yep.
Councillor Mason, you have your hand up.
Only because I thought we were coming to the end, but
Sorry.
at the end of the presentation is fine. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you for that, Councillor Mason. David,
Okay.
please continue.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So as I say, the committee may also consider potential severance or settlement of employment contracts of chief officers. So that might arise during the process that we've just gone through. So at any point during that process, there may be proposals to instead settle rather than go through that full process. And there are merits to that depending on the circumstances. But of course, if that was proposed, there would be detailed consideration as to whether that was an appropriate thing to do. It might also be raised as a standalone matter, might not have you know, followed on from a disciplinary issue or the like. So when in those circumstances, what would normally happen is that, say there was a proposed settlement, the terms of a settlement will have been discussed and negotiated by council officers, probably with external legal support, and with the individual chief officer, who would probably also have their own legal support. And what would then be coming forward to committee would be a proposed set of settlement terms to consider. So when considering those terms, what the committee needs to be asking itself is a settlement in these terms in the best interests of the council? Is it an appropriate use of public funds? Because as members, you have a fiduciary duty to taxpayers, of course, in the council's area. And whether the terms or the settlement is in line with the legislation that applies. So we're looking at things like the Employment Rights Act. There's various regulations, particularly local government early termination of employment regulations, 2006. If you want to go and have a look at those, the title of those is that is a bit longer, but I'll spare you from reading you the whole title. What those regulations say is that the council can come to settlements and severance agreements where to do so is in the interests of the efficient exercise of the council's functions, and to settle potential tribunal claims or that sort of thing. So it's there's a bit of scope there. There's also statutory guidance which applies. You may have seen in the news there's some draft regulations have been created which refer to exit payments in the public sector, and what those regulations are proposing, subject to them being amended, I doubt there will be, but is that there is a cap of £95,000 on any exit payment. Now that cap isn't absolute. Again, these regulations that I'm referring to are in draft form, presently, and there are exceptions to it. But what we have presently is guidance from the Secretary of State, which says that any proposed settlement which is of a value of £100,000 or more should be taken to full council rather than it being dealt with by the committee. So in those circumstances, you might not, as a committee, be dealing with it. You might hear it in the first instance and then refer it on to full council. That's not to say, again, that in all circumstances where a proposed settlement is in excess of that figure, that you wouldn't be determining it. There are certain circumstances, such as where, you know, it's a matter of urgency, and there are, due to perhaps sensitivities and other issues, it needs to be dealt with quickly. So there can be a departure from the guidance, but ordinarily not. So the other thing I want to touch on, I mean, of course, dealing with these issues requires you know, the utmost confidence. Confidentiality is very, very important in relation to dealing with these issues. You're dealing with personal data. You know, it's not just a you know, a council function. This is about individuals and impact upon their lives. And so you need to be extremely careful about the information that you will be given as part of this committee, and are required to keep confidential. Now, there is something, as you'll probably be aware, as members and officers, there is a statutory indemnity in place which says that when you are undertaking your functions in your roles as a member or an officer, you are protected from liability, if you like, for any consequent claims that might be made. Now, that indemnity only applies where a member or an officer is acting, and the wording from the legislation, it's from 1865, so quite antiquated. It says acting bona fide in the interests of the council, which in essence means in the council's best interests, genuinely in the council's best interests. So if a member or an officer were not considered to be acting in the council's best interests, i.e. disclosing confidential information that they had received in consequence of them being a member of this committee, then any subsequent loss that might be occasioned to the council or to other individuals could potentially be claimed back from the individuals, and they wouldn't be indemnified, so they wouldn't be personally liable. So it's really important, not just for yourselves, but also for the proper functioning of the council, that you are fully aware of the nature of where you have to, or if you ever have to deal with a matter that comes through the committee. It's really, really important that the information is dealt with confidentially. And as I say, that's not just for the council's benefit, because ultimately, if, for example, confidential information were disclosed that was being considered as part of that process, it might then be used as evidence by the chief officer, statutory officer, to support a claim against the council in the long run, to say, look, the council hasn't acted fairly here, and this has caused me significant damage to reputation or however. So these things can come back and haunt the council, if you like, if they're not dealt with properly. And it's also for the benefit of the third party, the chief officer concerned, because, as I say, we're not dealing with hard, cold functions of the council. You know, we're dealing with individuals and their lives as well. So it's important to respect that too. So, Chair, that's probably the extent of what I wanted to outline. I apologise if I've gone on slightly longer than perhaps anticipated, but I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Councillor Mason, you have your hand raised.
Yes, Madam Chairman, it's Councillor Mrs Mason. I prefer, if you don't mind.
Apologies, Councillor Mrs Mason.
Thank you. There's just two things I'd like some clarity on, and one again is on protocol. The monitoring officer has mentioned there will be item 6, we will be going into private and confidential for that, which I quite understand. But there is no item 6 on the published agenda. Are we correct in doing so? That's just a technical question that I'd like reassurance on. Perhaps that one could be answered first.
Okay, I'm happy to address that, or if Angela would like to address that.
Angela, would you?
Yes, absolutely, Chairman. So yes, you're quite right, Councillor Mrs. Mason. The urgent item is not on the agenda. However, under section, now David will correct me if I've forgot, it's 100B. Is it 100B? Section 100B on
sorry, it's section 100B, subsection 4B.
4 of the Local Government Act 1972.
Yeah.
If it's in the opinion of the chairman that it is of an urgent nature, it can go on to the agenda. And I believe, Chairman, discussions have been had with you with regards to this agenda item, and your agreement has been sought.
Yes, I can confirm that is the situation.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Appreciated. And there's just one other thing. The information you've given is very thorough and very helpful. It's also very complex, albeit mirrored roughly on the handout that we've had published. Whilst I realise this can't be done now, would it be possible to do a simple flow chart so that we can see the logical progression? Because you've said if the threshold test is met, it goes to A, and if it's not met, it goes to B. And I think in some ways it would be helpful to have a more visual representation of that information. And then if we have any questions around it, it would probably be answered almost by the flow chart. And the other question that just for confirmation, you've said all the time the committee. Do I take it is the full committee? We don't break into subcommittees for this?
I will answer that, and we stay as a full committee.
Thank you.
My understanding.
Chair, would you like me to address the other questions?
Please.
Okay, so well, it was the other question. It's about perhaps having a flow chart. Absolutely, I think a visual representation would definitely help. I referred to the Joint Negotiating Committee. Their handbook that itself sets out their suggested or required process, and it does indeed have a flow chart. So, Chair, if I'll get a hold of a copy of that, and if I email it to yourself and the officers for you to then share around with members, and hopefully that will assist. So that's what I would propose in those circumstances.
Thank you, David. That would be appreciated. I'm sure that would be very useful to be able to see that in that form. Thank you, Councillor Mrs. Mason. Councillor Hoy, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. First of all, I'd like to apologise to you for my lateness of them attending the meeting. I was on a phone call and didn't realise the time. And that may, I've just found out about you've said there's going to be something in private and confidential or exempt, an item 6, which I wasn't aware of. So when you do that, I'm going to have to move to another room, okay? Because I'm in a room where I'm next to the garden, basically. So I think things could be overheard potentially. So I'd have to move. And when you do that,
we will give you the opportunity to have time to move.
Thank you. And when did you find out this urgent item was being added to the agenda?
I have been notified prior to the meeting that this item would be added to the agenda, and that is the correct procedure as I understand it.
Today, then?
Before today.
Many days before today?
No.
I don't think it's hard to say what day you were advised on, Chairman, with respect.
I don't think I personally don't think it's actually relevant to give the number of days, and I don't think we need to waste. I don't believe I need to waste time at this meeting trying to remember exactly which day. I don't actually think that's important. I knew before the meeting, and it wasn't today. It was either yesterday or the day before, or even the day before that.
So within 3 days, right?
Possibly. Are you satisfied with that response, Councillor Hoy?
No, but I'm happy to carry on with the meeting.
Thank you for your question. Does anyone else have any questions for David in relation to the process? No? Well, thank you, David, for that presentation, and thank you for, we will look forward to a flowchart to give us a clearer understanding visually of how the process works and the steps involved. Members, we now have come to the end of the business that we can debate with members of the public present via the live stream. I will now move to a recommendation that under section 100A(4) of the Local Government Act 1972, the public be excluded from the meeting for the following item of business on the grounds that it involves the likely disclosure. Apologies, I've got something strange come up on my screen. Not sure what that was, I do apologise. Public be excluded from the meeting for the following item of business on the grounds that it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraph 1 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Act. Do I have a seconder?
I'll second it.
Thank you. Councillor Shaw, thank you. Sonia will now conduct a roll of call of names.
Chairman, I have indicated to speak.
You have just indicated to speak, as I read that out.
Sometimes.
Councillor Hoy.
Obviously, you know my difficulty. I'm sure everyone here knows my difficulty with exempt items generally. I have no doubt it is exempt because I'm sure you wouldn't put something through which wasn't. But I'm not sure how I can vote for something to be exempt when I have no idea what it is or what it's about. That's all. I'd like some clarification on that from an officer, if possible, please.
Chairman, if I may, I do understand the point that Councillor Hoy is making, but it is an unusual situation on this occasion, given the remit of this committee. All I can say, it is a highly sensitive employment matter. That's all I can say at this stage, Chairman. I think members will have to trust the officers on this one.
Thank you for that.
If I may just say that obviously, because you may have mentioned that earlier on in the meeting, which I was unable to see. That's quite helpful to know. Thank you.
Can I just say,
Councillor FD, you wish to speak?
Can I just say it might be useful if Angela Law repeats what she said at the beginning about indemnity, because Councillor Hoy missed that, I take it.
I heard that from Mr. Kitson, and I assume
she was very
I'm assuming it's the same
adamant about it.
Yes, sorry, Councillor Hoy, if I may, you understand the point about indemnity, but also given the sensitive and confidential nature, we have asked members that they need to confirm that there is no other members of your household or members of the public in the room with you, and that, as I can see, you have your camera on throughout the duration of that item of business. Thank you.
As I indicated earlier, I said I would have to move rooms when you said it would be going to exempt. I am fully aware. Just for your information, I've also served on the Personnel Committee of the Essex Fire Authority and did have hearings there, so I'm aware of the procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hoy. Thank you, Angela. So, Sonia, are you going to conduct a roll call of names?
I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
So members, if you can indicate if you'd like a recorded vote or if you're voting for, against the motion or abstaining. Councillor Mrs. Belton.
No recorded vote for.
Councillor FD.
No recorded vote for the motion.
Councillor Hoy.
No recorded vote and for the motion. I'll now leave the room to another room. Thank you.
Councillor Mrs Lumley.
No recorded vote and 4.
Councillor Mrs Mason.
Against recorded votes for the motion. Thank you.
Councillor Newport.
No and 4, please.
Councillor Mrs Rowe.
No and 4, thank you.
Councillor Mrs Shaw.
No and 4.
Councillor Sperring.
No and 4.
That's no recorded vote and unanimously approved, Chairman.
Thank you, Sonia. Members, that motion is carried.